Welcome to the Point. Got another 26 minutes of To the Point, and we're going through an overview of evolution. This is part of a series, Evolution is Impossible, and we've got to part 5 of Evolution is Impossible. I'm just going to recap a little bit from where we last got to. Just before I start that, if you have any feedback, I would love to know whether you're actually finding these series interesting. I haven't actually had any feedback for the last 2 shows, so please send some feedback to info@revelationtv.com. If you find I'm going too slowly or too fast, I'd love to hear about that. But I think this is really, really important stuff because all our children in school, and actually our the youngsters at university are all being taught about evolution. There isn't a great deal being taught about creation. So Revelation TV trying to change all that with Dr. Grady and many others, including myself. So let's just recap a little bit of where we got to last time. It's actually picture 38A. Brilliant. Okay, well, I'm talking about the law of biogenesis. The evolutionists insist that life evolved by chance. Let's just see what the evolutionists have to say. What the evolutionists like to say, let me just get this right. So they have what they call a spontaneous generation theory, which states that all life on planet Earth descended from a common single cell arising by chance in the primordial ooze roughly 3.5 billion years ago. Sometimes they say it's 3.7 billion years ago. So basically, let's just recap what they're actually teaching people at schools, universities these days, is that life evolved by chance in the primordial slime from a single cell in this primordial ooze. They're never very clear exactly what the primordial ooze. I'm very curious, but anyway, there we are. That's what they say. Let's look at the next picture now, 38b, the law of biogenesis. Now, there is actually a law in biology called the law of biogenesis, but very simply states that life cannot come from non-living materials. Now, that's a pretty obvious thing. You wouldn't expect a rock to turn into a crocodile. But actually, that's exactly what the evolutionists want you to believe. They want to believe that a rock turned into a living form. They go on, and I'm just quoting what the evolutionists are teaching our youngsters at school and universities. After this self-generation of the universe, primitive life arose by chance out of the primordial ooze sometime after the evolution of planet Earth, which was 4.54 billion years ago, and this process was known as the spontaneous generation of life. Now, let's be real. Nobody that I've ever heard of, ever seen, ever met, ever talked to, has ever seen life evolving from an inanimate object. But evolutionists insist this is what actually happened, and they even date it to 3.5 to 3.7 billion years ago. And what's more, they said it all happened by chance, according to evolutionists. So let's look at the next picture, which is number 39. What they're trying to tell us is that life evolved round about 3.5 billion years ago from a rock. Well, actually, that sounds outrageous, but that's actually more or less what they teach. So let's move on. If life does evolve from a rock, then perhaps we'd all better be very careful, because when we go to the bottom of our garden, you might find life evolving from a crocodile, and it might not. Sorry, life evolving from a rock at the bottom of the garden, and it might be a crocodile. It might be something very nasty. It might be something very nice, but it might be something nasty. Now, I don't think you expect life to evolve from a rock, but that's what the evolutionists are teaching us. And I'm being serious. They really are teaching exactly this. Now, according to evolution, these primitive life forms arose from inanimate matter. And as I say, that contradicts one of the basic laws of biology, the laws of Biogenesis. At this point, I want to talk about simple life forms. And this is what I basically want to say about simple life forms. There are no simple life forms. Very simply, there are no simple life forms because life is unbelievably complicated. Now, there are lots of directions I could go, but I'm just going to concentrate on something very fundamental to all life. All living forms have DNA, which you heard of, deoxyribonucleic acid in them. And this is the highly complicated information storage medium used in all plants, all animals, all fish, all birds. It's God's actual imprint on human life. God gave to us humans, he gave us our spirits, but he also formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into him the spirit of life. But of course, the man who was formed from the dust of the ground in Genesis 2, that was Adam, but it wasn't just a heap of sand. He was formed very carefully according to his genetic code, his DNA, his deoxyribonucleic acid. So my main point is there are no simple life forms. And I really object to people talking about primitive life forms because this just shows really how ignorant people are. Of course, it's not Darwin's fault. He didn't have an electron microscope, which we've got now. And if he had, I don't think he would have talked about primitive life forms. So I want now to digress a little bit, remembering that DNA is a design system. And to make it familiar, I want to talk about designs. How do we design things? How do you design a house? How do you design a car? How do you design a boat? How do you design an aeroplane? Well, I've actually chosen an aeroplane. And I've chosen a Spitfire, very famous in the Battle of Britain, one of the most famous aeroplanes ever produced in the United Kingdom, and a very important part in the Battle of Britain. So it was famously designed by R.J. Mitchell. I'm told that he sat on Beachy Head and watched seagulls flying around Beachy Head near Brighton. What he did was, let's look at the next slide, number 42. He designed a Spitfire. Now, actually, the designs, of course, that he did were much more complex than that, but that was just an overall design. And then he looked around for a really, really powerful engine. Famously, it was the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. Let's look at one of those in the next picture. Well done, that's excellent. That's a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, enormously powerful engine for such a small aeroplane. And now, of course, that was designed not by Mitchell himself, but by Rolls-Royce. So let's look at slide number 44, which is the Rolls-Royce design of the Merlin engine. That's just an overview. Of course, the actual designs, I'm quite sure there are literally hundreds and hundreds of different designs to make up the engine, but that is just an overall design of the engine. So you can see that a Spitfire with an engine, just very simply, has very, very carefully designed. And that's why it was such a successful plane in the Second World War. Now, there were over 20,000 of these Spitfires produced, and they were all made in special factories. Just out of interest, I live near Southampton, and in slide 45, here is a Spitfire factory in Southampton. You can see they were designed in lots of them all together. And actually, mostly, I believe, they were designed by ladies, because the men were, of course, all in the armed services. Now, one of the problems that we need to talk about with most man-designed things like Spitfires or cars or anything else is that they can't mend themselves. So let's have a look at slide 46, which is a crashed Spitfire. Now, sometimes crashed Spitfires could be taken into the factories and fixed and mended. Sometimes they had to be scrapped. Now, the body, of course, is quite different. Our human bodies, our bodies can mend themselves, which is actually quite unique. Now, our bodies, unlike Spitfires, come from one single cell. Let's look at slide 47. That's a fertilized egg. And the fertilized eggs, basically what happens is there are 23 chromosomes from the man and 23 chromosomes from the lady, making up a full complement of 46 chromosomes. And the very first cell is simply one cell, which very rapidly divides over a period of 9 months to make a human body. And it's a miracle. I've actually done a separate program on the miracle of conception and the building of a baby in the womb, which is a miracle. And let's look at the product of all that little miracle in slide 48. There's a newborn baby. And that's what happens in a 9-month period, quite unlike what happens in a Spitfire factory. No, the newborn baby, he's been in his mummy's womb, or might be her mummy's womb, for 9 months, and was formed in secret, according to Psalm 139, in his mother's womb. Now, sometimes humans crash, and some of you may have heard I was involved in a nasty car accident and fractured my leg. In slide 49, my fracture was very similar to this one, slide 49, which is a segmental fracture of the tibia. I don't know if you can see, there's a broken bone there. There we are. There's a broken bone. Basically, that's very, very similar. That's not actually my X-ray, but mine was very, very similar to that, and they basically put almost identical a steel shaft down the middle of my tibia. And I'm very, very grateful for the doctors who did that, but I don't want to take any of the wonder of what happens when the human body mends itself under the design of the deoxyribonucleic acid, the DNA, given by God in our bodies, because we have specialized bone cells in all of our bones called osteoblasts and osteoclasts, and they've got design in their DNA, in their design system. So if a bone gets broken over initially over a 6-week period, but it can take up to 2 years for a large bone like that to fully reform in all its strength, it basically mends itself, unlike a Spitfire or unlike a crash car. So that's the miracle of DNA. And anybody who talks about a simple life form really is just, to me, displaying complete ignorance about the whole subject of life. Psalm 139 verse 14 says, "I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made." Now, I know I'm talking about evolution right now. My main topic probably is the human body, and some of you may have heard me talking about the human brain and the respiratory system and the cardiovascular system and the hemoglobin and the DNA and all the other bits and pieces, and there's a lot more besides that I haven't spoken about yet. And the body is truly a miracle. And that's what the Bible says. Psalm 139 verse 14, "I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made." Let's look at the next slide, number 50. Basically, God has given us our DNA, our deoxyribonucleic acid, very, very famous. So let's talk a little bit about this DNA. It's quite literally God's language of biological information. Just to clarify, you're watching on a television probably. You might be watching on a computer, or you might even be watching on a DVD player. But basically, it's a computer of sorts, and it's got a very, very simple set of codes in there, which is simply a whole set of zeros and ones. Now, God has God's DNA geometric code is vastly, vastly more complicated than any computer. Far more complicated. The DNA is actually God's blueprint of every single cell in our body. Now, our body, we've got 100 trillion cells, and each one of them is different. I know that's skin, but actually skin cells there are not the same as skin cells there. And definitely skin cells on my nose are quite different from skin cells on my conjunctiva. That's the eye, the outside of the eye. That's still a skin cell, but that's completely different. And there are actually different types of skin cells all over the body, and they're all different because they're all pre-programmed by God. Now, within each of these 100 trillion cells is this genetic code called DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, and each one is individually coded per cell so that every single cell does the right thing. It's like the body of Christ. The body of Christ is made up of lots of different parts, and so is our body. Our body is made up of lots of different parts and very much interdependent on each other. Just talk a little bit about that. For example, I've got an eye, so if you've got two, we can see with our eyes using our rods and our cones, which are the special nerves at the back of the retina. But the nerves at the back of the retina, they transform the light, the photons, if you like, into electrical impulses which pass to the brain. Now, the brain is made up of enormously complicated cells. The brain weighs about 3 pounds and is actually enormously complicated, far more complicated than all the NASA supercomputers put together, but requires an enormous amount of oxygen. In fact, the brain uses 20% of the energy produced in the body. So the brain and the eyes are very dependent on the respiratory system and the cardiovascular system and the skeletal system. They're all totally interdependent, which is why I really get annoyed when people talk about simple life forms, because life is not simple. So coming back to each individual cell, each cell is encoded in the DNA with the exact instructions for that particular cell to build the proteins for that particular cell. And as I said, there are different types of cells: skin cells, eye cells, brain cells, heart cells, liver cells, blood cells, all sorts of different cells. And even though there are different types of blood cells, they're all different. All of them are different. Now, you'll recognize the next slide, 51. It's President Clinton, when he was actually president of the United States. And this is what he actually said in the White House on June the 26th, 2000. And this is what he actually said. "Today, we are learning the language in which God created life. We are gaining ever more awe for the complexity, the beauty, the wonder of God's most divine and sacred gift." Isn't that amazing? That's the President of the United States saying that today, back in the year 2000, we're learning the language in which God created life. We are gaining ever more awe for the complexity, the beauty, the wonder of God's most divine and sacred gift. Well, I don't know what President Clinton what his thoughts are on creation and evolution, but the complexity and the beauty and the wonder of God's most divine and sacred gift doesn't sound like a simple life form to me. I don't know what it sounds like to you. Now, let's look now at the next picture, which is number 52, the molecular structure of DNA. It's actually unbelievably complicated. I told you that inside the 100 trillion cells in our body is this famous double helix, which is known as DNA, and it's God's biological information system. It's actually the single most amazing information system in the universe. It's unbelievably complex, and yet it's very, very compact. That's because it uses a 3 out of 4 digital code. Unlike our computers, which are a whole series of ones and zeros, this is a 3 out of 4 geometric code. Now, each of our 100 trillion cells in our bodies contains a strand of DNA which has all the biological information for that one cell. Let's look at the next picture, number 53. Remember how tiny each individual cell is. If you actually were able to get a chain of DNA and tease it out, it would be very thin, but it would be 6 feet long. Can you imagine that? Because cells are tiny. They're absolutely tiny, and yet the genetic code within them has so much information on it that you can spread it out over 6 feet. DNA is actually vastly more complex than all of the supercomputers at NASA. Now let's look at slide 54. Those are the supercomputers at NASA. They are by far the most complicated computers in the world. And yet, DNA is vastly, vastly more complicated as a storage medium than all of those supercomputers. Let's look now at something which is just make-believe, if you like. Slide 55, a teaspoon of DNA. It's not possible to have a teaspoon of DNA. However, I'm just stretching your imagination a little bit here. Supposing it was possible to have a teaspoonful of DNA. Now, how much genetic information could that teaspoon of DNA hold? Well, that teaspoon of DNA could hold all the precise assembly instructions for all the proteins of all the 1,000 million species of animals that ever existed, and still have enough storage information to store all of the information in every single book that's ever been written. In other words, what I'm telling you is that DNA is unbelievably powerful, unbelievably complicated. Now, this design system, I suggest to you, can only come from a super intelligence. Let's look at slide 56. This information system can only be designed by a super intelligence. I do not believe, let's look at slide 57, that life arose by chance in the primordial slime. Life is so unbelievably complicated, and all the various systems within life are so interdependent on each other, it is simply not possible. It is simply not possible for life to evolve by chance. We even know from switching theory it's not possible for DNA to evolve by chance. But there's much more to life than just DNA. There's a whole lot more besides. It is just simply not possible for life evolve by chance. So I reject evolution completely. I do not accept primitive life forms, and I definitely do not accept that life evolved by chance in the primordial slime. You wouldn't expect spitfires to design and manufacture themselves. Well, let me tell you, spitfires compared with the human body are very, very simple. The human body is much more complicated than a spitfire. According to the theory of evolution, the Earth is 4.6 billion years old, and early life forms containing DNA arose by chance in the primordial ooze 3.8 or 3.5 billion years ago. I don't think so. I'm sorry, I think that's absolute garbage. I'm really sorry. You'll very rarely see me rude on Revelation TV, but I think this is absolute rubbish. Now, let's look now at the molecular structure of DNA. This was discovered by Francis Crick and James Watson in slide 58. The molecular structure of DNA was discovered in 1953 by Francis Crick and James Watson, who both later received the Nobel Prize for Physiology of Medicine. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about them in the next program. But I want you to see just how amazing life is and how ridiculous this idea of evolution is. I cannot think why people teach this as fact, because to anybody who can think for themselves, it's rubbish. I hope you're enjoying this. Do please get on my website, freechristianteaching.org, and please send some feedback to info@revelationtv.com. We'd love to hear from you. If you think I'm spending too long or too little time on each subject, I'd love to hear from you. But anyway, it's lovely to have you. The most important thing about Revelation TV is you viewers. We'd love to hear from you, and we just want to give you information that will be helpful for you in your walk with Jesus Christ. Thanks so much for listening to us, and God bless you.